Our next presenter will be Dr. Heidie Bissell. She is the animal nutritionist at Disney's Animal Science and Environment program. Her topic today is going to be bat nutrition. Go ahead, Heidie.
I'm going to talk about nutrition of bats, and I had some great introductions this morning with lots of people talking about nutrition, so I hope this isn't too repetitive. But the main things I'm going to talk about today is just sort of an overview of the diversity of bat nutrition. And as Dr. Wellahan said, there's a field of comparative medicine, but there's also a field of comparative nutrition where we take what we know of other animals that have either similar lifestyles or genetically related, and what we can learn from them and how we can apply it to bats. And then, because this is a welfare section, I'm going to talk about different ways to assess nutritional welfare. So the first thing, which a lot of folks have alluded to, is the comparative nutrition of energy. And bats have some really unique stuff that they do with energy. So first of all, flight is expensive. Animals that fly can, while they're flying, that energy use can be up to 15 times what it is, what they are at rest. So here's an example from this paper where they measured the heart rate or the energy expenditure of bats while they were flying versus when they were resting at night, which is obviously their more active time of day, and then when they were, actually sleeping at day, I guess. But things that animals do who fly is they stay light. So birds famously have hollow bones. Bats have a lot of physiology that helps them stay light, one of which is a very simple GI tract with a very fast passage rate. So things go through quickly so they don't stay in the gut for long periods of time, taking up room and adding weight. They do behavioral things. Mentioned earlier was huddling, but they also choose their roost selection with reflection of the ambient temperature and wind patterns and stuff like that. And basically the behavioral things, depending on different papers where they've measured this, can reduce the energy use by 5 to 10%. So that helps them save energy. Torpor is another aspect of their physiology. So bats are small, and generally small animals are going to have very high metabolic rates, much higher metabolic rates than larger animals. And bats are also susceptible. They have this fluctuating food supply. So whether they eat insects or fruits or many of these other things, there are seasons to that. Things come and go throughout the year. And so, and they have a limited ability to store fat. And they spend this huge amount of energy to fly. So they need a way to sort of conserve energy where they can so they don't starve to death. So torpor is a resting period. And it may or may not involve lowering their body temperature. So depending on some environmental conditions, they can lower, some bats will lower their body temperature to go into torpor. Others will do this behavior even while maintaining their body temperature. And torpor is even better than just huddling and stuff. It can reduce their energy use by over 50%. And obviously that allows them to keep going and to get through the night or get through the day, I guess, and go fly again. And then hibernation saves the most energy. You'll notice this is not a bat. So hibernation is essential for surviving longer periods of low food availability. Again, with both insects and fruits, those are highly seasonal, and depending on where the bat lives, can be completely unavailable for months at a time. So hibernation is 3 or more consecutive days of torpor with some arousals. So it's the same thing as torpor, just longer. And true hibernation can reduce energy costs by 98%. So this is an extremely efficient way to save that energy for when you need it most. And interestingly, even though large animals have lower metabolic rates gram for gram than small animals, when they're hibernating, it's all the same. It doesn't matter how big you are. So they use the same energy gram for gram when they're hibernating as a bear does when they're hibernating, which I find fascinating. The final thing that animals or that bats need energy for or need to conserve energy for is migration. And famously, birds also migrate. And so there's been a lot of work on how birds migrate, and it is not at all the same as the way that bats migrate. So how they use energy is very different. The one thing that is in common is that the fuel for migration in both bats and birds is fat. So they're burning fat. That makes a lot of sense. Fat has a lot of calories per gram. So birds will actually bulk up before migration. They'll have several weeks of gaining lots of weight, eating a lot more. But bats do not do this. There's very little evidence that migrating bats really do a lot of bulking up. And mostly they eat on the wing as they migrate. Birds commonly switch their diet to a completely different type of food in advance of migration. But bats, insectivores continue eating insects, fruit-eating bats continue eating fruit. There is some evidence that bats will select more unsaturated fats, which unsaturated fats are more mobile and easier to burn for peak activity. So it is considered a better fat for migrating because it's more available to the animal. And they may be able to do some selection and choose higher unsaturated fat insects, which is interesting. Birds do this whole thing where they increase their liver, they increase all these enzymes for putting on fat. And we don't know if bats do it, but they probably don't, since they don't do this bulking up thing. And then birds catabolize their digestive system and use the actual gut itself for fuel. But again, that's unlikely in bats who eat along the way. And then the main difference is that birds in general, with a few exceptions, some chickadees, some hummingbirds, don't use torpor, but bats clearly do. So all of these energy strategies are going to enable them to survive migration. And both insectivores and frugivores will migrate. Not all bats migrate, but bats across lots of different food types will migrate. So, as many people have mentioned, bats eat all sorts of different foods. So the main ones being insects and fruits or nectar, but also we have some vertebrate prey eaters out there and some blood eaters. And then there's even weirder ones that eat leaves and bark and nuts and fungus and probably other things too. I'm not going to talk about those as much. There's not as much out there about that. So here's the macronutrient profile of different common food sources. So there is red here is protein. So this shows the level of protein in a lot of these. And you can see that the animal-derived ones are high in protein. Pollen is also quite high in protein. And then the more plant-type ones are higher in the blue category, which is starch or sugars, mostly sugars in these. Oops, sorry, I have a touchy mouse. And then the yellow is fat. There's not too much fat in almost anything except for insect larvae, which is not something that wild bats eat a lot of, but it's something that we very commonly feed insectivorous bats in managed care. And then green is fiber, and then the white is minerals. And you can see everything has some minerals. You can see that there's very low protein in domestic fruit compared to that of wild fruit. So these all seem very different, and it seems like there's a huge diversity in what bats eat. But if you know how they process things, let's see, you'll know that they have a little technique they do where they chew up, this bat's been given a grape, and they chew out this.
And that's the spat. Left of the grape.
They chew up and they spit out the fibrous portion. So if you take that same graph and take out that green fiber section and look at the remaining stuff. So this is what the bats are actually consuming or swallowing, and that's going into their gut. You can see that without the fiber section, it pretty much divides cleanly into mostly protein or mostly sugars. And actually insect larvae and insects become a lot closer to each other. The fiber that was in the insects is the chitinous exoskeleton, which bats may have some ability to digest, but it's still not huge. So overall, bats are consuming either a high protein or a high sugar diet, and they're really only eating or consuming the most digestible portions of their food. Because of this, and because of flight, they have a very simple GI tract. They have a stomach, small intestine, large intestine. It is very much not specialized with lots of different compartments like you'll see in some herbivores. So there's not a lot of differentiation in this. So I'm going to lump insects and fruits together, and I'm going to do this for some comparative reasons, which is that is sort of this ancestral lineage of mammals that Dr. Wellahan talked about, is that some of the most basic fundamental mammal body types have these simple digestive tracts, and they eat these very digestible things. If you don't consume the skeleton of insects, then you, by and large, are just eating that readily digestible protein and fat. And the same with fruit. If you don't eat the pulpy part of fruit, then what you're actually consuming is this very easy to digest proteins and sugars. And proteins and sugars can be digested by single-celled organisms. They're digested by mammalian enzymes. So they don't require a lot of specialization. So if you look at the macronutrients again, this green bar here is the sort of approximate level of protein required by a bat. And you'll see that they can meet their protein requirement on just about anything except for domestic fruit. They can, in general, meet most of their mineral requirement as well. And because animals can use fat and to some extent protein for energy, they have sufficient energy on all of these as well. The one thing that starts getting critical when you get down to these low protein foods is amino acid balance. You may have protein, but it may not be the right quality. You might not have the amino acids that you need. So one of the main ones that's limiting in bats is taurine. So for some fruit eating bats, it's going to be important that at least taurine, if not a broader look at some different amino acids, needs to be supplemented. So where do bats get minerals? Mostly they're going to get the minerals from their main foods, insects or fruit or whatever they're eating. But water can also be a source of minerals, especially in wild bats that are drinking from puddles in contact with the soil. Some bats are known to go to clay licks or salt licks. Earlier, we talked about how salt blocks are really popular with bats. So this is a study that wondered why bats visit the mineral licks of the Amazonian rainforest, specifically whether they visited these licks to detoxify plant toxins or whether they went to these salt licks to get the minerals that they needed. And so if you look at this pink is the level of minerals in the fruits, so potassium, and then this green bar is the level that the bats need to stay alive. So you can see that potassium, insects and the salt lick had plenty of potassium. The sodium was met by all these, magnesium. You'll look that calcium is deficient in insects, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. And there was plenty of iron. So the authors concluded that it was mostly the detoxification aspect that they were going to these licks for rather than the minerals. So let's talk about calcium, because that's a hot topic in bats, and it's a common cause of nutritional problems in managed care. So bugs don't have bones. They, despite what the Halloween industry may tell you, there are no spines or ribs or any other bones in bugs. And so bugs have an almost non-existent need for calcium themselves, so they don't absorb it. So if there is calcium in a bug, it is because either it's in the gut of the bug or it's somehow on the surface of the bug in managed care. So wild bats, they may use these mineral licks for getting minerals. They may alternate foods and eat different types of insects, some of which may have more calcium than others. And as was mentioned earlier, the skeleton is actually a really big calcium reserve in the body, and bats likely do cycle through that since they often are eating low calcium diets. In managed care, it's super important that we supplement with minerals. I was glad to hear everybody talking about the importance of that earlier. Two common methods are gut loading the insects. That means feeding the feeder bugs something that contains calcium within a few minutes to hours of feeding it to the bats, because it'll go quickly through the insect, they'll poop it out, and then that insect is no longer gut loaded. Same with dusting. Insects can quickly bathe or move that dust off of them very quickly, sometimes within seconds. So it's very important that if dusting is the method used, that you know that the bat is eating it right away while there's still dust on it. Iron is another hot topic. So iron storage disease is a very common problem in fruit bats. It can be managed with diet, and a lot of folks are doing, sounds like Luby's doing a really great job with that. Iron absorption increases with vitamin C, and it specifically increases when the meal itself contains both iron and vitamin C. So if you separate those in time and feed the whatever contains iron at a separate time of day from whatever contains vitamin C, if you separate those in time, it will be less absorption. It's actually if it's together in the same food that it's a problem. And then iron absorption decreases with tannic acid. So this is a study. So with tannins, iron absorption is lower than without tannins. So tannic acid is that bitter taste in tea, and there's several other chelators that will also bind iron and decrease it. And again, the goal with separating it from the vitamin C and feeding it in conjunction with tannins is that you're lowering the load of iron that the bat would absorb. And I just wanted to put in a word of caution. Iron is sneaky, and it's in many supplements, mineral blocks, salt blocks, commercial feeds. You may be feeding a calcium supplement or a calcium phosphorus supplement, and you think, oh, it only says calcium and phosphorus on it, but it will be loaded with iron. So it's very important to test your feeds. A lot of tea, it was earlier mentioned black tea. There are some black teas that are just chock full of iron and others that are not. So it's really important that you actually send out your specific foods for analysis. And if you want, we can chat in the comments later about some recommended labs or testing. It's generally not that expensive, between $30 and $40 for a complete mineral panel on your feeds. I heard baby food mentioned earlier. Baby food is often fortified with iron. And definitely don't rely on the label claims. They're often just putting in the iron that they themselves added, which doesn't necessarily reflect any iron that was present in the ingredients themselves. Fluoride is another one, and it's one that we almost never talk about in the field of animal nutrition, except for bats. So bats, particularly flying foxes, seem unusually susceptible to fluorosis, which is too much fluoride. Common sources of this are municipal water supplies, and in one case, it was some contaminated shrimp meal that was in a food item. Signs of this would be not eating, weakness, and low bone density. Vitamins, lots of interesting stuff going on with vitamins in bats. So going alphabetically through the vitamins, bats likely get most of their B vitamins from insects. And I'd like to point out that even fruit-eating bats in the wild are going to be eating a fair amount of insects, because fruits in the wild are contaminated with insect larvae, insect eggs, and even that small amount is likely both a significant source of protein, a significant source of high-quality protein, and B vitamins. So when we're feeding domestic fruits on fruit-only diets, B vitamins are something that can become deficient, but are often in these vitamin and mineral premixes that we give to bats. Bats can't synthesize their own vitamin C. So like humans and guinea pigs and anteaters, they've lost that ability. So they must get it in their diet, but not at the same time as the iron portion of their diet. Bats don't appear to need, and in some cases, potentially even be able to use dietary vitamin D, meaning put into the diet. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it or that it's bad to do it, but it doesn't appear that that's a major way that they are able to obtain vitamin D. However, palm bats and flying foxes do require sunlight or UVB exposure to generate vitamin D. So it's important that those species get some sunlight. And then some bats are reported to be deficient in vitamin E in numerous cases. And one likely reason for that is because it's an antioxidant. And when bats have too much iron, they're going to use more vitamin E to counteract the inflammatoriness of too much iron. So, and then low vitamin E can be another cause of dilated cardiomyopathy, as can poor amino acid balance and low taurine. So I heard a couple folks mention that this morning, and so those are some things to look at. Okay, so everybody's now questioning their supplementation, and basically I always tell folks to think like Goldilocks. You don't want to offer too little because they do need some supplementation. Domestic insects and domestic fruits are not good models for wild insects and wild fruits. So we do need to put back in some of the stuff that's missing. You don't want to give too much. A lot of folks think, well, if a little sprinkle is good, then a big sprinkle must be even better. And food is not love, and vitamin and mineral supplements are definitely not the sort of thing that you want to overdo either. You're going for the just right, happy thing in the middle. And we'll talk more about ways that you can figure that out at the end. So I want to talk a little bit about carnivory. So there are bats that eat all sorts of other things, including birds, fish, small mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and even other bats. In general, whole adult vertebrate prey tend to be a nearly complete diet for vertebrate carnivores. We generally find that, and this is again comparative nutrition from all of our other carnivores, as long as the vertebrate prey are adults, they tend to be complete. They have fully formed skeletons. They have all the various things that mammals need. The problem comes in that often due to size constraints, we're feeding like baby mice or juvenile other animals. And so those can be deficient in some things and might need supplementation. Let's talk about everybody's favorite vampire bats. Vampire or blood eating or sanguivore has evolved numerous times. There are birds who do this. It's thought that it's something like the oxpeckers who start pecking at the insects on an animal, and then that leaves a little wound, and then they sort of discover that and gradually grow to become that. So there's quite a few species of birds actually who are sanguivorous. And then obviously all the mosquitoes and mites and spiders and things that are external parasites, all the internal parasitic worms and other things. There's the lampreys. But among mammals, there's really only those 3 species of bats that are blood eating. Other than that, mammals have tended not to do this. So blood is mostly water. So it's actually quite interesting. The vampire bats, as they're drinking this liquid thing, are also urinating to get rid of most of that water. Blood has almost no fat. When they're eating, and they fly away, they'll have gained 50% of their body weight. So even though it's mostly water and they're peeing out this water, they still gain a huge amount from that. They produce this heavily concentrated urine, and their kidneys produce very high levels of antioxidants, likely because of the high amount of iron in blood. And I should point out that the iron overload disorder, so far that I am aware, is only in the fruit bats. These guys, even though they're eating this high amount of iron, appear to be able to deal with it. From other zoos that have vampire bats, they can be very prey specific. So they may like pigs or sheep or cow or chicken, and they may not like switching between those. So you might need to try several different types of prey to figure out the ones that your vampire bats like. Vampire bats, just beforehand, we mentioned that the fruit bats tend to have fairly low blood urea levels, making it hard to diagnose some things. But the vampire bats actually have really high blood urea levels at levels that would kill most other mammals. And this is part of that like high protein diet. Interestingly, we just assume that animals that are carnivores are going to use that extra protein that they eat to make the sugar that they need, but it doesn't appear that vampire bats do that. They don't form sugar from the protein that they eat. So the sugar that they need to run their brains and things like that is coming from the blood sugar of the animal that they're feeding from. And then the microbiome in these guys has a huge role to play in terms of immune support and nutrition and actually dealing with some of this oxidative stuff. Okay, so moving on to the second topic, which is nutritional welfare and how we assess it and how you can monitor it. And this is a term that's fairly new as people started talking more about welfare. So it's not a term that there's a lot out there on. So earlier, folks mentioned the 5 freedoms. So animal welfare originally got founded on these freedoms from pain and discomfort and hunger. In 2013, it kind of got rebranded as sort of opportunities. So they're basically the same thing as the 5 freedoms, just in a more positive way. So opportunities for a well-balanced diet, to self-maintain, to have health, species-specific behaviors, choice and control. And then AZA, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, has kind of identified 5 domains, which is sort of the same thing again. One thing you'll notice on all of these is that nutrition is always listed first. And it is fairly fundamental to good animal health and welfare. But as we're working on welfare plans, it often almost gets skipped over, where we spend lots and lots of time talking about welfare in terms of behavior and stuff like that. However, nutrition is part of all of these. If you look carefully, freedom from disease is nutrition. Freedom to express normal behavior. A huge chunk of most animals' behavioral repertoire is feeding behaviors. Self-maintain, optimal health, species-specific behaviors, choice and control, all of these have to do with nutrition. So nutrition is actually a part of all of these welfare aspects. So how do you assess it? So the key nutritional welfare concern is the diet meeting the needs of the animals? And I break those down into 2 main things: the physical needs of the animal and the behavioral needs of the animal. So we'll go through those. So physical assessments. So body condition score is the one that almost everybody's going to be familiar with. In the research literature, it's almost always defined as the body mass divided by the forearm length for bats. That's the forearm. However, this requires that you have a bat in hand. And for those of us working with bats in managed care, we don't necessarily always want to catch up a bat to assess this. So we often use much more visual. This is for a mouse, not a bat, but sorry, twitchy mouse. So these drawings kind of identify a low body condition score animal where the vertebrae are visible to a high body condition score. And the reason you're doing body condition scores is giving you an idea of the overall energetic status of your animal. And it's reflective of longer term trends. So generally, just because you skipped lunch, you're not going to change your body condition score. In some animals, especially low conditioned animals, it can be difficult to differentiate from muscle condition. And so that's sort of advanced body condition scoring, is when you can tell a poorly muscled animal from a very well-built animal. And with flying things like bats, you may run into issues like that. So I wasn't able to find a body condition scoring scale specifically for bats of this sort of visual sort. However, I really loved, and so I added in what was mentioned earlier, the Dorito to football scale. So I suggest we refine that and make it into a scale that folks can use if they don't have a bat in hand, because I thought that was very descriptive and very practical. Fecal condition is one way to get an idea of what's going on with the gut health of the animal. And you can grade that on a scale of like solid to liquid. And you can also rinse it in a sieve to look at the particle size of the particles that are going through. Because bats spit out a lot of the particles, the presence of particles at all may be an indication that there's some either tooth or chewing issues going on. So if you notice the level of undigested particles, so that can be part of your, every few months, you sieve some feces and look and see if there's anything unusual. And I was unable to find a bat fecal condition scoring scale, which I found fascinating considering that bat guano is of major economic importance. So I pulled out from our nutrition advisory group, our fecal scoring center, I pulled out the tufted capuchin scale, which I thought vaguely looked like some of the bat feces I've seen. So this might be one way that you could routinely score, and you can do these assessments on a group too. They don't always have to be at some individual level. But again, I'm hoping somebody will help develop, and maybe it's out there and I just wasn't able to find it, a fecal condition scoring specifically for bats. So I'd like to put in a plug for the AZA Nutrition Advisory Group. We have a website, nagonline.net. And there's 2 sites on there I think this group would find useful, which is our Body Condition Scoring Resource Center, which has every body condition scoring scale for animals that all sorts of different species that we found, except bats, and the Fecal Condition Scoring, which is the same, and again, doesn't have a bat scale. On both of those sites, there are instructions on how to develop your own scale, and there's a spot where you can submit it to us and we can include it on there. So I'm putting in a plug, since they don't seem to be available, or if you have one, to please submit it so that it can be included as a resource for everyone. Continuing on with the physical assessments, veterinarians will look at blood values. Skeletal conditions can be diagnostic of many nutritional disorders, and dental condition is an important one. But you don't have to be a veterinarian to do all of this. Close observers can look at their coat and nail condition, so cracked or torn nails, poor condition, dry coat can be indicators of various nutritional disorders. Coat color, some mineral deficiencies will lead to a change in coat color. And eye condition, whether there's cloudiness or crustiness, can be some nutritional disorders. This is one paper. There are several papers out there on blood normal values, so you can compare to blood normal values. I just like to always caution folks that just because the blood is deficient or high in something doesn't necessarily mean the diet is. So just because something is deficient in iron doesn't mean you need to go supplementing iron. There's a more holistic evaluation of what's going on and what would make sense to do. And the second half of nutritional welfare is behavioral assessments. And so you can assess a lot of things about bat feeding behavior. So one is their appetite and enthusiasm for food. So how readily do they come down? How readily do they eat things? And all of these ways to assess behavior should be non-judgmental. So being very enthusiastic for food may be good in some circumstances, being not so ravenous for food may be good in other ones. This is just a score without judgment. Activity budget, how much time does the animal spend doing the full gamut of foraging and feeding behaviors? So looking for food, settling on food, biting into food, consuming it, doing the chewing behaviors. Feed behavioral diversity. How many of these different behaviors are they exhibiting? Dietary flexibility. How readily does your animal or your group of animals try new foods? In the wild, almost every food that bats eat is very seasonal. So they, by definition, are eating new foods every few weeks or months. However, in managed care, we're often feeding the same things throughout the year or the same mix of foods continuously throughout the year. Whereas a more species appropriate thing would be seasonal changes in the diet being fed. So will the animal readily try that? Is that something that your animals are able to do? And then dietary diversity. Does the animal consume a variety of foods? So if you run out of cantaloupe and you can only get honeydew, will your bats starve? You know, some of this supply chain stuff with COVID, we really came to light that we really cannot have animals who only eat one thing in case there's any sort of supply chain hiccup. You can work with a nutritionist to do a nutritional evaluation of the diet. So is the diet, including the water sources, balanced to meet the bat's needs? Are the bats eating the diet completely or being selective? Earlier at Luby, they talked about how, you know, if you feed too much, then they're just going to pick out their favorite things and they might not be eating a balanced diet. And obviously, if you feed too little, you're going to cause energetic issues. So is the diet that's actually selected by the bats balanced? And is the consumption appropriate for the seasons? Bats will gain and lose weight as you get into breeding season and through reproduction. And yes, that is the world's biggest banana or smallest bat. Very fun picture. So when assessing welfare, assessments should have 3 parts. So there's the thing that you can measure, and that should be fairly judgmentless. And then the goal for that group, and then obviously comparing the thing you measured to the goal. So for example, if you measure body weight as 50 grams and the goal weight that you set previously based on body condition or health concerns is 40 to 45 grams, and the last time it was 60 grams, then you can say you're moving closer to the goal, and that is your welfare assessment. Another example is appetite. You say you measure the animal as being ravenous. But your goal is that they're gaining weight. So maybe, that is exactly what you're looking for. Or maybe you're trying to reduce aggression, in which case you're not looking for that. And that would be, you're moving farther away from your goal. So I just always encourage folks to make sure that the thing you're measuring doesn't have a judgment attached to it, including body condition scoring. That should be fixed, and then you compare it to your goal. So just to review, bats are supremely adapted to flight with a simple GI tract and fast passage rate and all sorts of physiological adaptations. They have unique mineral nutrition that leads them to need different nutrients and different minerals than other mammals, specialized vitamin nutrition, that energy physiology where they can ramp up for flight and ramp down for energy conservation there is unparalleled and pretty amazing. And of course, like all animals, they need excellent welfare. Here are some tools that you might find interesting as you look to evaluate your bat diets. So Zoo Diet Navigator is free software that you can use to manage your animal diets and analyze your animal diets if you put in the data about your foods. NAG Online is the site I mentioned earlier that has the fecal condition and body condition scoring. There's also quite a few papers on bat nutrition there. And then the National Animal Nutrition Program is through the USDA, and currently it only has animal feeds up there of use to commercial livestock. But there's a group of us that are working with them closely to get foods used by zoo animals and North American wildlife put in there as well. And it's going to include a fairly hefty chunk of things like fruit and browse and insects and seafood as well. And so stay tuned that resource will become more and more available, and you'll be able to pull data from there into Zoo Diet Navigator. So we're hoping that would be in place by the end of 2025. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to everyone, and we can open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Heidi. So the first question is, what insects would have unsaturated fats?
I don't know. I saw that go by, and the studies where they did this were laboratory studies where they gave them preferences with manufactured feeds, and they were able to tell. So I don't actually know what it would look like in the wild. Apologize.
Okay, thank you. Is there any medical conditions or problems described to be linked to obesity in bats?
I'm not aware of any, but in other animals, obesity is not inherently problematic, but it can make things like arthritis worse. It increases your risk of problems with giving birth, so dystocia, and it can aggravate a lot of cardiac disease, and that's another common issue in bats. So I think it's well worth it to manage animals to not be obese.
Thank you. Next question. Given the macronutrient difference in domestic and wild fruit, should rehabilitators and others with frutivores in human care source wild fruit to ensure they get appropriate protein, or as long as they get taurine and other limiting nutrient supplements, are they okay?
So animals require nutrients, not specific foods. Even the dietary specialists can often be fed on alternate foods. And it's almost from a management perspective, very difficult to get wild fruits year round. I think looking at which domesticated fruits you're feeding, there are some that are more nutrient dense than others. Supplementing when possible is probably the most practical alternative. I mean, that said, if you live somewhere warm and tropical where there's wild fruits around year round, I think the thing that wild fruits might bring to the situation that would be good would be some of those wild insect contaminations that can be a pretty significant source of protein in some seasons.
Thank you. Next question, are salt licks good for insectivores or just frutivores?
So I don't actually, I feel like this is hard to answer for any animal, whether salt licks are good for them or not, unless you have some known salt deficiency issue going on. That said, most animals will excrete salt readily if they're consuming it in excess. So to the best of my knowledge, there's no harm as long as you've tested that salt to make sure it's not contaminated with iron. One crude way is the color of the salt block. If it's white, it probably is less likely to be contaminated with iron. If it is red, then it's probably one of those salt and mineral blocks, and that almost certainly has iron contamination in it.
Thank you. Next question is, what do you recommend as a gut load for insects?
Oh, that is the age-old question. There have been so many studies trying all sorts of different things. There are a lot of commercial gut load products out there. Many of them are good. The main thing that I would say is just the timing of it, making sure that those bugs are eating right before you feed them to the animal. It doesn't, and a lot of those diets for bugs, oops, sorry, I sat still too long, my light went off. A lot of those bugs products are not meant to sustain bugs long-term. So it's not something you would keep the bugs on for weeks due to bug welfare. But you would put them on just in the 24 hours or 12 hours before you feed them out to the bat. But there are some newer bug gut loading diets that are meant for longer term period for the bugs. So you just have to know your product and know what's appropriate for the insects as well as the bats.
Thank you. Next question is, where do you get feed analyzed?
So a lot of zoos and aquariums will use Dairy One Laboratories in Ithaca, New York. They used to run a zoo-specific nutrient division called Zooquarius. I think that might have been merged back into Dairy One as a whole, but they'll do a complete mineral panel for, I think, $35, including like macronutrients and, just a basic nutrition panel. And they'll send you all your stuff that can be put right into Zoo Diet Navigator.
Thank you. Next question, do you always supplement with taurine as tannins, I apologize, as a preventative, or would you only do this if high iron is demonstrated?
That's a good question. And I think there's merit to both ways. Sometimes you just don't want a problem to develop, but at the same time, I think you can complicate your life a lot if you're treating problems that don't actually exist yet. So I would say if you have iron overload issues in your bats, then everybody, whether or not they have it demonstrated in them as an individual, I would give it to. But if your entire collection of bats is not exhibiting that, then it's probably unnecessary.
Okay. This is a clarifying question. Bats of any kind, or do any bats of any kind manufacture their own vitamin C?
I do not know. That was my understanding, is that none of them do. And I saw several references about it, but it's a huge and diverse group. And if some of them have it, I would totally believe it. It is an enzyme that animals have, and then many or several species have lost. So if somebody knows that there are some out there, I'm sure that there's an exception.
Okay. The next question says, I thought that prey species preference in vampire bats was dependent on the vampire bats as a species, not as individuals or communities, as in certain vampire species had certain preferences across the species. Is this not the case under human care? It was my understanding that most common vampire bats in captive care consume beef blood. Other than enrichment, is this not the case?
I've personally never been at an institution that had vampire bats, so I'm not speaking from a lot of experience. When I talked to folks who had, they mentioned that this was a concern and that their bats had very specific, but not necessarily beef species, and that it might have even switched over the years. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Next question. Have you found any reason for baldness other than parasites?
Personally, haven't had to work with that much. But there are some nutritional imbalances that can lead to thinner hair or hair loss, or like often we see it more as dry hair or scruffy hair or a change in the texture of the hair. So no, I mean, I think parasites is probably still one of the, or maybe allergies as one of the causes, but that would be a veterinary question.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, in insectivores, how important is it to vary the type of insects provided?
I think for many reasons, it is important that animals eat a variety of foods, some of which are just simple practicality of supply chain. And some of it is just the nature of having that animal be able to eat diverse foods and the potential for complementary nutritional profiles. That said, I would, for insects, say it's probably more important to vary the life stages as well, if possible, because a lot of the insects that we're feeding are these juvenile life stages that are very different from the adult stages. So I think, rather than mealworms and superworms and just kind of many variations on almost the same thing, I would go for even mealworms and later life stage, like when it turns into a beetle. But I think if you can get the bats to eat it and you can manage it, because obviously like managing flying insects is going to be a challenge to feed to bats and manage care, but if you've got some sources of different types of insects and different life stages of insects, I think that's probably good. Doesn't mean you can't not do it. I mean, obviously people are being very successful on mealworm-based diets, but it probably is worth considering if that might work for you.
Thank you. Next question says, what's the best vitamin protocol besides gut-loading insects that can be used for short-term captivity of O section, as in rehabilitation?
Of O section. Oh, okay. So, I mean, gut loading and dusting are the tried and true methods that everybody uses. They're depending on what your bats will eat. You can try feeding different amounts of things that you can like put supplements in, or sometimes people even inject supplements into something like a waxworm. Please don't ask me about the welfare of the waxworm under that circumstance, but I know that that's a way that we've given medications and the occasional supplement for a rehab bat.
Okay, next question. Is there a source that talks about the importance of UVB lighting for flying foxes?
I definitely had, sorry, I didn't put a lot of references in my paper, but there are a couple papers out there talking about that. And noting changes in their blood, the active form of vitamin D in their blood when exposed to UVB light.
Okay, thank you.
I can put them in there's some paper sharing section of Hoover. I can try and find that.
That would be awesome. Thank you. Next question is, Carnivory bats, will they only feed on live prey or will they feed on collected blood?
Oh, they will feed on collected blood. I believe it's a bit of a challenge to get them when they're first brought in, but quite a few zoos have had vampire bats over the years and feed them on collected blood. There's protocols for using an anticoagulant so that the blood stays liquid, and there's protocols for not using an anticoagulant and dealing with it that way. So yeah, there's protocols out there for doing that.
Okay, next question. Can hepatic liver sometimes be caused by bats being overweight?
This is more of a veterinary question. I believe the issue, and please, maybe one of the veterinarians can chime in, is less that being overweight causes it. It's more that being overweight and then losing weight can trigger that. So if there's an illness or a night without food or something like that, that could be a triggering event for that. But overall, being overweight definitely increases the risk of hepatic issues.
Okay, thank you. The next question says, I thought that feeding the mealworm beetles is bad for bats. Was that incorrect?
I think it probably depends on the bat and the size of the bat. Like some of the littlest ones, they might be too big for. I've heard horror stories, but nothing from something like a bat about superworms sometimes being eaten whole and then eating their way through like a frog or something. I've always heard about it from people who've heard about it and never actually seen it. And so some of the smaller bats, maybe that would be a concern. But since the bats are sort of chewing them up anyway and not necessarily swallowing them whole, I don't think that would be an issue. I don't know. I haven't worked as much with insectivorous bats.
Okay, there's one more question in here. So just as a reminder, we have about 10 more minutes. If you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the chat. The next question is UVB recommended for all bats or just diurnal?
I believe it's the palm bats and the flying foxes are the only ones I've seen that seem to have a requirement. And the Luby folks this morning said something similar. So I think that's all that's known, but I would imagine that any bat that spends its entire daytime in a cave would not have that requirement. So I think there's some probably natural history element to that as well.
Okay, next question. Would swollen joints in insectivore bats be nutritional based?
It could be, but I think there's just a lot of things that can cause that. Again, that would be a sort of a veterinary question of all the possible things that would lead to that.
Okay, the next question says, can you reiterate the issues with fluoride?
So there's been several case studies where bats, basically they died in many cases or were seriously ill, but I think in all cases, at least some of the bats died. And when they looked around to find the cause, they found that it was somehow the bats were getting fluoride. In one case, it was like the city water. In another case, I think they found it in contaminated feed. But these were, water and feed that were being fed to other animals without concern. So it appears to be something that these guys are susceptible to. Now that said, if you're feeding entirely distilled water or filtered water, you may be removing some minerals that they do need, but hopefully that's available in the rest of the diet. So protocols to not feed fluoridated city water are probably good. And again, I think most fluoridated city water probably is at a safe level. It was just in this one case, it was higher than typical. That led to that.
Okay, next question. Do you know anything about what a bat's social structure impacts selection of available food in captivity? Similar to how you said providing too much food can lead bats to just pick their favorite. Do social dominant bats tend to get first pick and leave certain things to other bats?
Hopefully some of the husbandry people can answer that more specifically to bats. That is absolutely something we see in just about every other species. I would assume it is the same in bats, which is why hopefully those mineral supplements and stuff are being, sprinkled throughout the food, that, feeding places that there's many feeding places so that everybody has a chance to feed. And, I think there's a lot of husbandry things you can do to minimize just, putting one bowl out for an entire group of bats where you then have issues like that.
Okay, next question. Are there any whole fruits you can think of that should not be offered in its entirety because of the rinds being toxic or anything else?
There probably are some, I think the mango family has some toxic rinds or at least that causes irritation in a lot of animals. There's probably others, but nothing nothing comes to mind. I
Okay,
did see a question go by about a mineral supplement versus a vitamin supplement. And I just wanted to remind folks that those are two different things. So like a calcium and phosphorus supplement or a calcium carbonate supplement is different than a multivitamin. A multivitamin by definition is unlikely to have minerals, although there are some multivitamin, multi-mineral things out there. But obviously for the bats that were worried about iron overload, would avoid those and keep the mineral supplements away from things like your vitamin C supplement.
okay. Thank you, Heidi.